maravilhosa, Dionei. Obrigado a todos que apresentaram no simpósio. Foi uma excelente tarde. Essa palestra vai ser feita em inglês e eu vou agora falar inglês para receber bem a nossa palestrante. So thank you all for being for this whole afternoon in Brazil. It's getting dark. You can barely see me throughout the screen now, I believe. Sorry for the sound. As we are getting ready to welcome Dr. Ellen Contini-Morava, I'd like to thank the high level of all presentation, all participants and questions. And I'd like to make also a summary of Ellen's trajectory. As usual in Amazonicas, we try to bring as keynote speakers relevant linguists doing worldwide top level research that can help us bring new perspective into our data and the kind of languages we are working on. So that's the case of Dr. Ellen Contini-Morava. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Anthropology in the University of Virginia. She defended her PhD dissertation at Columbia University in 1983, and throughout her career, she has kept a dedicated interest on meanings and discourse functions of grammatical forms in a general sense. She has specialized in Bantu languages, and of course, the work on the noun classes of these languages led Dr. Contini-Morava to become a key scholar in the topic of nominal classification. Since her 1994 publication, Noun Classification in Swahili, Dr. Contini-Morava has devoted great efforts towards developing a holistic view of nominal classification in discourse, grammar, and the lexicon. More recently, she has been working with Yves Desinger on determiners and noun classifiers in the Mopan Maya language of Belize, and she's also the leading author of the paper Functions of Nominal Classification, co-authored with Marcin Pilarski, a paper that sparked worldwide attention, and especially among several of us Amazonianists, by bringing a discourse and semantic-based approach to the typology of nominal classification. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Contini-Morava, who will present today the talk, Reflections on Nominal Classification. Ellen, you are ready to share your screen whenever you want.
Okay. I'm going to start by attaching my
Vou começar colocando aqui as minhas referências no chat da reunião, para que elas fiquem já disponíveis, caso alguém tenha interesse. Vou compartilhar minha tela.
Okay. So you can see my screen?
Muito bem, todos podem ver minha tela?
Okay. So let me thank the organizers.
Gostaria de começar agradecendo os organizadores e organizadoras da reunião por me convidarem para essa grande conferência que está acontecendo em uma circunstância tão difícil. Eu admiro muito o trabalho de todos e todas pelo esforço que vocês colocaram nisso. Gostaria de começar fazendo um reconhecimento ao povo Monacan, que são os guardiões da terra, onde a Universidade de Virgínia reside, e prestar minhas homenagens para os povos passados e o povo presente. Então, eu gostaria de começar com algumas premissas que são subjacentes ao conceito tradicional de acordo e o conceito relacionado de acordo canônico, que alguns de vocês podem conhecer. Vou dar alguns exemplos de classificação nominal que são problemáticos para fins de abordagem tradicional ao acordo, e eu vou também sugerir uma perspectiva alternativa da linguagem, onde a função comunicativa tem importância central. Isso pode ser uma nova forma, uma forma diferente de pensar sobre os fenômenos do que os conceitos tradicionais de acordo, agreement. Em primeiro lugar, alguns estudiosos estabelecem uma distinção entre classificadores e classes de substantivos e gênero. Então, vocês já viram algumas vezes hoje esse mesmo quadro, e eu sei que isso é familiar para muitos de vocês. Greenwald argumentava que existe um efeito de contínuo de uma perspectiva mais léxica para a gramática, colocando classificadores de gênero de maneira gramaticalizada, e os classificadores entram no meio do léxico e do que é gramático. Eu coloquei uma lista de classificadores que Greenwald, essa pesquisadora, incluiu. Em um artigo com Seifert, ela falou também sobre motivação semântica. Então, as classes de substantivos e gênero têm
the assignment of nouns to classes or to genders is less semantically motivated than the relationship between nouns and classifiers in classifier systems, according to them. Now, it has been pointed out often that Amazonian languages, many of them fall somewhere in between these sort of classifiers and noun classes, that you can't make a sharp distinction between them. Some languages, in fact, have some of each, as we've also heard today. So I'm not going to pronounce on the question of where in the typology things fit. I just brought in this diagram in order to explain where I'm going to draw my examples from. So I'm going to focus on the concept of agreement. So I'm focusing mainly on languages where that concept has actually been invoked and where it's said that agreement exists. And that is used as a defining property of gender and of noun class systems, and has also been applied to various classifier systems in Amazonian languages, such as Miranya, as Seifert has described it. So in this talk, I'm going to include some examples of gender and noun class from other parts of the world as well. But I'm not going to talk about East Asian classifier systems, since they're not usually described in terms of agreement. I also leave out situations where there's some doubt about whether the notion of agreement applies, such as Munduruku, which Gomez has described as possibly agreement might not be relevant to it. I'll also not be talking about the derivational use of classifiers. Again, even though it's very common in the Amazonian languages, again, because agreement is not directly what is involved there. So the traditional notion of agreement, first of all, I'm just going to give examples from the far end of, the most grammaticalized end of the spectrum. Here is an example from Portuguese, where we have the nouns in green and the agreeing morphology in blue for masculine and in red for feminine. And the gray words are ones that are not distinguished between masculine and feminine. So Swahili is a noun class language, and as most of you know, noun class and agreement and gender are generally thought to be quite similar in terms of the fact that in a language with noun classes or genders, all the nouns are classified, and the marking, and you have obligatory marking of class or gender on various elements associated with a noun. So in the Swahili example, we have the noun stone, and the stone belongs to class 5. This is the numbering system that's used for Bantu languages. And other kinds of things in the sentence that relate to the word stone, such as the object of see, and the word that, and the subject of fall, as well as the relativized, the head of the relative construction. All of those refer to something of class 5. So these are the agreement markers. And it happens that in Swahili, the noun tu has a prefix that indicates the class. So, assumptions behind the traditional account of agreement. Many linguists use terms like concord or concordal agreement to refer to the relationship between a noun and classificatory markers elsewhere in the sentence. The traditional conception says that you have a situation in which the grammatical form of one element in the sentence, the target in the terminology of Corbett, is dependent on morphosyntactic or semantic features of another element called the controller or trigger. So one dimension to the traditional notion of agreement is feature matching. That is, the relevant features of the controller and the target must match. A second is directionality. The grammatical properties of the target are determined by those of the controller and not vice versa. A third is redundancy. Agreement morphology contributes no independent semantic content to the message being communicated. These assumptions are all connected in that the formal marking of the target is treated as entirely predictable from the properties of the controller. And there are some more assumptions that also come into play in talking about agreement. One is the idea that lack of choice is the same thing as lack of informativeness. That is, wherever something is obligatory, it's not contributing any information. And this goes along with a view of meaning from point of view of information theory, which is very prominent in linguistics. A second assumption is a truth conditional view of semantics. That is, the sentence is seen as an expression of a logical proposition, and the meaning of a sentence is said to be the conditions under which that sentence is true. So linguistic forms that don't affect the truth conditions of a sentence are semantically empty, according to this view. This will come up when we talk about the question of what classificatory markers are doing. So Corbett, in a series of influential works, has incorporated the traditional notion of agreement in his concept of canonical agreement, which he discusses in his 2006 book, Agreement, and in several other places. Corbett and Fedden have also written a series of articles on this topic, and they summarize the properties of canonical agreement in a chart. First of all, the controller is present, has an overt expression of features, and is consistent in the agreements it takes. Its part of speech is not relevant. The target has bound expression of agreement, obligatory marking, doubling the marking of the noun. The marking is regular, alliterative, productive. The target has a single controller, and its part of speech is not relevant. The part of speech not relevant, what they mean by that is that there are not subcategories of parts of speech that have different, that are marked differently for agreement. For example, a difference between numerals and adjectives. That's what they mean by part of speech not relevant. The domain, the agreement is asymmetric. That is, gender of an adjective depends on that of a noun. Local, for example, within the noun phrase, although they also recognize that you get agreement outside of the noun phrase. And there are multiple domains. So for example, demonstratives, adjectives, and so on. Features. features are lexical. You have matching values, and there's no choice in values. So by lexical, it's meant that nouns are marked in the lexicon for particular classification. And then other elements in the sentence will follow along with whatever the lexical marking of the noun is. And there are no particular conditions on where agreement is supposed to apply. In addition, there are some principles. The first principle of canonical agreement is redundant rather than informative. And second, canonical agreement is syntactically simple. This is relevant to the idea of it operating within the boundaries of the sentence. Now, Corbett doesn't say why these properties are canonical, rather than their opposites. Canonical is not the equivalent of statistically frequent. Corbett acknowledges that the best and clearest examples, here I'm quoting, those most closely matching the canon, may well not be the most frequent. They may indeed be extremely rare. He distinguishes between canonical and prototypical. Canonical can be clearly defined, but in principle, there need not be a real instance, only approximations, while prototypical implies real instances. It's apparent that from this list that all cases where agreement features can be seen as making an independent contribution to the message, such as when there's no controller around or when there's a choice between agreement markers, are viewed as non-canonical. So I've highlighted the properties that have to do with feature matching, directionality, and redundancy. Now, Corbett and Fedden develop a notion of canonical gender that incorporates canonical agreement. They say the degree of canonicity of a gender system depends in part on the degree of canonicity of the agreement through which it is expressed. In other words, a gender system is not fully canonical as long as its agreement system is not fully canonical. Also, the concept of canonical gender can include other types of nominal classification. In other words, not just gender and noun class systems. Classifier systems can be treated as various systems of nominal classification, they say, which are typically further away in the theoretical space from canonical gender. They don't provide a cutoff point of what types of classifier systems would or would not be included. But since agreement is a defining property of gender, systems that involve some kind of agreement would be closer to canonical. The traditional conception of agreement affects the way many linguists talk about markers of nominal classification. For example, it's said that a certain noun takes a certain classifier, that is directionality, or that a classifier identifies an inherent property of a noun, which is feature matching. And some also conclude that the classifier is therefore redundant, that is redundancy. So these are the main properties of the traditional notion. All right, so I'm going to go into some data that pose problems for this traditional account of agreement. One kind of problem is the controller not being there. You remember that controller being there was part of the criteria, one of the criteria for canonical agreement. Another is the classification marker isn't obligatory. Again, that was being obligatory was part of the criteria for canonical agreement. A third situation is alternative classification markers are possible, and that too is a violation. So to start with some examples. Recall that principle 2 of canonical agreement is that agreement should be syntactically simple. Rules of syntax are supposed to apply within the boundaries of a sentence, So the sentence must also be the domain of the rule of agreement. An agreement rule is supposed to require a controller, so it would be hard to write such a rule if no control occurs in the sentence. So this is a quote from Derbyshire and Payne. Amazonian languages, they say, are characterized by the scarcity of fully identifying nominal expressions in natural discourse. And we actually heard an example of that this morning. Earlier this afternoon, that Mohenio also, 80% of the time, classifiers are used without an associated noun. So this is quite common. So here's just one example. This is from Barnes. There's a conversation about a snail shell with holes drilled in it that's used as a musical instrument. They say, at the time of the recording of the discourse, the snail shell had already been passed around. The speaker was holding it. He was going to be playing a tune on it. As he spoke into the recorder, his first reference to the shell was atiga, this three-dimensional object. He continued to describe its use in dances and compared its sound with tiga, that three-dimensional object, referring to the type of shell that used to be used. In the 14 sentences, there are 9 occurrences of the classifier ga, three-dimensional object. The only time that the name of the snail shell was used was when he told me what to say, when I played the recording for my friends. So the situation of deixis is an example of a situation where you don't have a controller in the sentence. Pretty clear. And is quite common and frequent, and at the same time, a violation of canonical agreement. Another example is anaphora, which again is quite common. In this case of anaphora, often there's no controller in the same sentence as the agreements. And this is an example from Eichenwald from Tariana. In this context, there's a shirt belonging to an evil spirit who takes off the shirt and gives it to some men, but the shirt has the power of the evil spirit. Eichenwald says Tariana has agreement in noun class in head modifier constructions. But we see that we actually only have the noun present in the first sentence. So the 3 dots are a sentence boundary, and then we have other sentences where it doesn't occur. So it happens that the word for shirt means thing, classifier, a cloth, a thing made out of cloth. Right, so this is the noun in the first sentence, and then we have several mentions of it using a demonstrative that follow. Not only demonstrative, but also an example with a pronoun. So the references to the shirt in the later sentences only use the classifier cloth. And there are various anaphoric references to the men as verb subjects that I haven't highlighted, but that those two are not included. The word men doesn't actually occur in this text either. So both deixis, shown in the last example, and anaphora, shown in this one, are important and well-known ways that markers of nominal classification are used, even though these uses don't fit into the traditional notion of agreement that limit syntax to the sentence. This was recognized by Payne a long time ago, who said that in these cases, the concord is simply on a potentially larger than sentence level. And she's right, but the fact is that agreement rules are supposed to apply within the sentence. So another example, in the cases of deixis and anaphora, we usually can identify a noun that corresponds to the agreements and say that the controller is understood. Of course, talking about an understood controller is just a way of making it look like an agreement rule exists. But what if the understood controller doesn't match the features of the agreement? In this example, thank you, spoken by a female, the understood controller would be the first person singular pronoun eu, which does not distinguish gender. This situation is sometimes called an underspecified controller, which is a way of preserving the idea that directionality and feature matching are the expectation. In other words, underspecified, it should be specified for gender, but it isn't. But what if the understood controller doesn't match, right? Another kind of absent controller is a situation where it would be hard to identify a particular noun that could serve as the controller. So this is a Swahili proverb. That which is talked about exists, and if it does not exist, it will come. So here we have various references to something, to class 5, but there is no noun of class 5 in the sentence. And in this situation, it happens that there's more than one potential noun that could be referred to here. There is the noun jambo, which means an abstract thing. There's another noun neno, meaning word, which is often extended to mean a thing or a matter. But class 5 is also used to derive augmentatives. So it could be reference to something that's big or important. The fact is that we can't really identify what noun might have been the controller or might be the controller here. And what if no noun exists in the language that would identify the kind of referent that's being talked about? So these examples come from Seifart's work on Miranya, where he talks about, this is an experiment that he devised where there's a set of objects that are made out of wood, these in this photograph down here. And one speaker is given a photograph. This is the speaker in this picture. He's given a photograph of the objects in some kind of arrangement. And he's supposed to describe that arrangement to the other speaker, who has to then reproduce it with the objects in front of him, okay, but without seeing the photograph. So this is the way they're talking about it. There are two flat and round ones, this round, that one, round one over there. Take these two little chunks. But there are no words for these things. So the only way they have to talk about them is by using these classification markers. Again, the problem of describing this as agreement, given that there actually are no nouns available to be controllers, is problematic. A further problem is, of course, a situation where the controller could be associated with more than one classification marker. So this is an example from Corbett's book, the Russian word for doctor. The doctor came, where the verb is marked as masculine. You could also say the doctor came with the same word for doctor, and the doctor happens to be feminine, so the verb is marked as feminine. In this case, the word vrach is described as a hybrid noun because it can co-occur with either masculine or feminine gender marking. So here's another example from Pilaga. Vidal states that entities that are normally classified according to, entities are normally classified according to an inherent position. So here the knife is classified as horizontal. Seraki put the knife in the box. But in a later sentence, that person is eating something with a knife. The knife is associated with a vertical classification marker. So it's hard to say that either vertical or horizontal is an inherent property of a knife. And also clearly the question of feature matching, or that the controller is causing the agreement is also problematic here. Here's another example, this one from Kilivila from Senft. Different classificatory particles used with the same noun. So Senft describes the classificatory particle ke, meaning wooden, as redundant when you put it with the word canoe, because canoes in the Trobrians are always made out of wood. But he overheard someone saying one day, "Look at this small dinghy behind the motorboat." So this is a small boat that's being towed behind a larger boat. And in this case, the classifier for child is being used instead of the wooden one. But interestingly enough, wooden is still being used on the adjective. All right, so the word this has the classifier for child, and the word for wooden, the word for small has the classifier for wood. So both of these would be problematic for the traditional notion of agreement. First of all, the fact that you have child rather than the conventionalized wood on the word this, but also the fact that you can get more than one classification marker in the same noun phrase, which again should not happen. Another kind of problem is when you have alternation between a general and a specific class marker. Here's an example of this from Miranya. The earlier examples of different classification markers led to differences in the interpretation of the noun. But some languages allow a choice between a general classifier and a more specific one. From the point of view of truth conditional semantics, these examples would be synonymous. That is, the sentence would be true no matter which specific, whether a general or a specific classifier was used. Both of them could be described as agreement, but the notion of agreement doesn't help us understand the choice between these alternatives. Why use the general one here and the specific one there? And with decontextualized examples like these, you can't really discover why the speaker would use one rather than the other. So this is an example from context of a different language, Yagua, where there is also alternation between a general classifier and a specific one. This one is from a narrative. And the sentences here occur in this sequence in the narrative. First, the general classifier is used with the noun pot in describing an action that involves the pot, banging on the pot. The second example is after having mentioned that the pot is being banged on with a general classifier, the person then focuses in on the pot and says more about it. It was one of the ancient pots of bluish color. And when they do that, they add this more specific classification marker. So recall that obligatory marking on the target is one of the criteria for canonical agreement. So optionality also would be a problem for this. So here, presence or absence of the classifier would not make a difference in the truth conditions of the sentence. That is, you could either have it there or not, and the sentence would continue to be true. Eichenwald says that the classifier on the numeral in Tariana is optional, and she says it occurs when the referent is important for future discourse. So it is possible to understand when the classification marker is going to be used versus when it's not going to be used. But again, the notion of agreement isn't really helping us understand that. Now, canonical gender is not a hypothesis that is subject to disconfirmation. It's an idealized model that is intended to be applied to a range of linguistic phenomena. Examples where a noun is associated with different classification markers are described as instances of recategorization of the controlling noun, sometimes leading to inconsistent agreement. Such cases are non-canonical. As Corbett and Fedden say, all types of gender recategorization violate the canonical gender principle. Now, it's not clear how the notion of recategorization would fit situations like a choice between a general and a specific classifier, since presumably either of those categorizations would fit the interpretation of the noun. Now, terms like understood controller, underspecified controller, hybrid noun, recategorization of the controller, absolute use of agreement markers, and so on, are all names for situations that don't fit the traditional notion of agreement. In what Corbett and Fedden call the canonical world, such violations are not seen as counterexamples to the idea of canonical agreement, because you can't really have counterexamples, just deviations from canonicity. But what if we looked at language in a different way, not embracing the assumptions behind the traditional view of agreement? So I'm going to present a perspective that has been influential in my own work, what's come to be called Columbia School of Linguistics, and I give a few references to that here. From this approach, there are certain orienting principles about language that lead to ways of thinking about language. One, namely, the communicative function of language being central to the way it works. And also the fact that language is a device of communication for human beings as opposed to machines or apes or some other type of being. So it follows from the communicative function that the structural units of language would be meaningful signals. And meaning is thought of as conceptual content that's signaled by some specific linguistic form. Signals and meanings are language specific. So by that is meant that this approach is a kind of emic perspective. So the kinds of questions that are asked are not, for example, how does such and such a language express this idea, but rather, what meanings do the signs of this language express? Also, if you have a closed system of opposition, which sometimes happens in classification systems, although not always, the choice of one meaning suggests the rejection of another. For example, a system that has a residual classifier that's used for nouns that don't fit into the categories of the others would be making use of this kind of principle. A message is a construal of linguistic forms in a particular communicative act. That's the result of both linguistic meanings and pragmatic context. Meanings in this approach are seen as instrumental. They help steer the hearer toward an intended message. And the relation between the meaning and the message is one of contribution rather than composition. That composition is, again, something that's part of traditional ways of viewing sentence meaning, that the meaning of the sentence is put together from the meanings of all of the elements in it. But that means that every element in the sentence, you have to be able to find something in the sentence that is a reflection of that. Whereas with contribution, you can have certain types of meanings that are sort of like traffic signals that are just helping you understand the message as a whole. And you may not be able to actually pinpoint where is that meaning exactly in the message. So the distribution of linguistic forms in this view is motivated by, first of all, the contribution that their meanings make to the message being communicated, and various pragmatic factors. And this is where the human users come in. For example, ease of processing, inference, iconicity, egocentricity. All of these are things that human beings use in order to sort of process information. Social conventions are also relevant. Conventions of discourse organization, all of these would be factors that come into play in how the meanings of linguistic forms are interpreted. And the source of data is preferably natural discourse rather than decontextualized invented sentences. So we've seen that also in some of the presentations today, that if you look at discourse, you find all kinds of interesting things, including often surprises. So even unexpected situations that speakers might reject if you invented that sentence and gave it to them independent of context and said, can you say this? They might say, no, you couldn't. So it's quite possible that if a speaker of Kilivila was given the sentence about the canoe that Senft mentioned, using the classifier for child rather than the one for wooden, they might say, oh no, you can't use a classifier for child. He doesn't actually say whether they would say that, but it's quite possible that that would be the case. So it really is important to be able to have access to natural discourse. So a communicative perspective on agreement or concord, how might it help to think about it? Instead of regarding situations like absence of control or choice among different classification markers or optionality of classification marker as deviations or exceptions, these cases are instead evidence of how classification markers contribute to communication. In other words, they would be central rather than marginal or peripheral. Reference is a communicative act. Just go back to a definition of reference from Lyon's book on semantics. It's the speaker who refers by using some appropriate expression. He invests the expression with reference by the act of reference. So we sometimes talk about nouns referring to things, but of course nouns don't refer to anything. People refer to things, and they sometimes use nouns to do it, but sometimes you don't have to. Sometimes something more general is enough. So mentioning a noun is a relatively precise way for a speaker to identify a referent, and classification marking is a relatively less precise way. So here's an example, this one from Chacon. A father says to his son while leaving the house, bring me my tubular. And here it's understood that a rifle is what is meant. So even though I admit that Chacon argues that the shape morphemes of Tucano are somewhere between lexical and grammatical, so possibly not, strictly speaking, classifiers, the point is that they can provide an alternative way to identify a reference when you don't need the precision of a noun. So concord can be understood as a shorthand for obligatory marking of certain elements by classification markers, rather than as a relationship of control between a noun and a classification marker. The choice of classification marker may be governed not by pre-existing classification of the lexicon, but by the message a speaker is choosing to convey about the referent. Now, I don't really have time to go back to all of the examples that I used to illustrate the problems of the traditional view of agreement, but it should be clear that that view does not include either a communicative function or human speakers. It's a mechanical process that involves only linguistic elements. From that point of view, meaningfulness is a deviation. From a communicative point of view, meaningfulness is central. So, where it's possible to choose between different classification markers, it's better to say that it's the speaker, not the noun, who takes a classification marker consistent with his or her message, and also consistent with his or her assessment of how much information the hearer needs in order to understand. I mean, so it's a reciprocal process that the speaker is considering what the hearer needs to know. And even when a co-referential noun is mentioned, and when no choice is possible, classification markers still contribute to communication by helping group modifiers with modifieds or cross-referencing participants in a predication. That is, they're not redundant from a communicative point of view, even if they don't add information. Again, this goes back to the idea of truth conditions and so on. So how might communicative perspective help understand agreement in a language where all nouns are actually classified and where other elements are obligatorily marked for noun class? In other words, at the extreme end of, or the most canonical end, I suppose, of gender and noun class. So going back to the examples that I gave earlier of Swahili, in this first example, we have, I have seen the stone that fell. The noun stone is present in the sentence. The associated noun class markers make it clear what the demonstrative modifies, give information about what plays the role of the object of the verb see, the subject of the verb fall, and the head of the relativized verb. In the second example, we have no noun, so the hearer has to infer what the referent is just from the information that it's something connected to class 5. So a possible analysis of the concordial or agreement marker, li, in this sentence, or in either of these sentences, would be the referent is something that could be denoted by a noun of class 5. This could apply either to the situation where there actually is a class 5 noun around, or to the situation where there is no such noun having been mentioned, and where it's not even absolutely sure what noun it might be. So the classification marker is helping identify the referent by limiting the possible range of reference to something that could be named by a noun of class 5. Now, you might wonder whether nouns in this class, whether this class is semantically motivated. That is the assignment of nouns to this class make any sense semantically? The next slide, I'll show you a network style analysis of Swahili class 5. The assignment of nouns in general in Bantu languages usually involves some arbitrariness, but also a lot of semantic motivation. So here's a possible network analysis of class 5, kinds of nouns that are associated with this class. The nouns in this class carry the prefix G or sometimes 0. That is no overt prefix. The solid lines here show a part-whole relationship. So plant offspring would be fruits or leaves. The dotted lines show various kinds of extensions, such as metaphorical or metonymic ones. I guess dotted lines don't show up that clearly here, but so for example, leaves or things associated with leaves, this would be a metonymic type of association. Woven mats, cloths, clothing. Then this noun class prefix is also used productively, as I mentioned earlier, to derive augmentatives. So large things, that is a noun from any other class can be moved into class 5, or its prefix can be replaced with class 5 prefix, and it means a big one of these. And in addition, things that are feared or again, associated with large size. So even though it may not be possible to find a single common denominator of meaning for this noun class prefix, still the fact that the noun classes do have some semantic motivation facilitates deictic and anaphoric use of the so-called concords. So if presence or absence of a linguistic form is optional, and described by speakers as synonymous, that is, synonymy between presence or absence of the form. Use or non-use of that form probably reflects discourse factors such as foregrounding, contrast, topic structuring, and so on. To understand the motivation behind presence or absence of an optional form, we need data from connected discourse, not just decontextualized sentences. And to understand the phenomenon of concordial agreement, we should broaden our conception of meaning beyond truth conditional semantics and broaden the scope of our data beyond the sentence. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for this wonderful presentation, which really opens up some window for understanding this kind of problems that I'm sure several of us share in the analysis of the language we are familiar with. So thank you very much. I would like to leave the audience free to ask questions. We have one hand raised by Sebastian Drew. Sebastian, could you hold on a second? I think we had first question in the chat. That was by Bianca Maria de Souza. Bianca, would you like to step in, show up, and ask yourself your question? Oh, okay, please go ahead.
Hi, I want to question you about data 9 in the slide.
About, I'm sorry?
It's a data that I have here in the slide is the 9.
Number 9 in your slides.
Slide number 9?
Yes.
Okay, let's go back to it. I could probably do this faster in some way, but I'm not sure exactly how. Oh, maybe I should just not, just a minute. Okay. Yes, 9.
It's just a curiosity. You know that the use of the two demonstrative, it's always happens in that language, or if happens just one, and if the meaning, I don't know, change?
So I'm sorry, in which language do you mean?
It's
the data 9.
Yeah, it's example number 9, I think.
Oh, example, I'm sorry. I
Yes.
thought you meant slide 9. Let me find example 9. Here we go. Oh, in Kilivila. Okay, so you're asking whether the demonstrative is required?
Yes, in the 9b, this child, this. If just use, I don't know, good, if that this is possible in that language, and it's just change, you know?
So
if you know that.
I don't know this language myself, so I'm going based on what Zenf says. The format, the way to form the demonstrative is that you insert the classification, what he calls classificatory particle. You insert it between the two parts of the demonstrative. So what he said is that this example was unusual. That is, normally child is not used for a boat. And that's why he brought it in, because it looks as if the speaker is creatively employing the classifier for child to talk about as if the boat, because the boat is pulling along another small boat behind it, it looks like a child. So his point, in fact, he himself says that he can't tell whether the classifier is changing the meaning of the noun or whether the noun is changing the meaning of the classifier. He says that it looks as if both of them are affecting the meaning. And it may be, in fact, that they're talking about something that's not really a canoe either. It's a sort of a boat, but they're using the word canoe because that's the closest word that they have for it. So they're doing things with both the word canoe and the word child, putting them together in a way to express something that they hadn't seen, that was unusual for them.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Right. Please, Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. This was really an interesting talk, and I agree very much with your perspective on language and putting discourse in the center of the attention and so forth. I really agree a lot. Interesting. I have been trained in the linguistic approach, which tries to combine that with a constructivist or constitutionist semantics, which still tries to tie everything, including the referential part of meaning, the propositional part, and the illocutory part, to formal properties. So it's a much more complex endeavor than just truth values, of course. Yeah, absolutely. It's nice that we're still exactly on that page, because you use that as an example for situations where discourse can show constructions which wouldn't show up easily in elicitation, right? Because people are creative and so forth. And I think in this case, it's quite clear that this is really something where the creative act of putting things together in order to prevail a new kind of meaning has been used. But there might be many other cases, and that is my question. How do you differentiate between creative discourse showing traditionally ungrammatical phenomena on the one hand, and real ungrammatical phenomena? Because we do, in discourse, we do mistakes, right? In Portuguese, a speaker may use the male or feminine article with a non-matching noun when he or she forgets how he started the sentence and so forth. So we do have mistakes. And so it is really hard to differentiate between such more free or constructive or use of discourse and of mistakes which will be recognized as such. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I agree that it may not be easy to distinguish between a mistake and a creative use. I suppose that if the use is something that that makes communicative sense, and also when people make mistakes, sometimes they correct themselves. That sometimes happens. I don't have a sort of a general algorithm for figuring out when something is a mistake or not, but also if there's some systematicity to it, that could be an additional way of noticing. Now this, I suppose, probably they don't, in this particular example, they probably don't often refer to canoes with the word child. On the other hand, thinking of this as a mistake, I mean, one problem with mistake is, of course, if you invent a sentence and you give it to the speaker and you say, can you say this? And they say no, then you jump to the conclusion that you can't do it.
No, that would be too easy, of course.
Yeah. So that's but yes, people do misspeak sometimes. Yeah, there's no question.
Yeah. In this particular case, this really is a little duckling of the bigger ship, right? So it is really a child. It is absolutely clear. But so this is not a clear example, but there might be borderline cases of
there could be
mistakes and.
All right. Thank you, Sebastian. Now it's turn to Françoise Rose.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm in very bad conditions. I'm in a bus with my phone, so I hope I can make myself clear, and I wear a mask too. I have a question regarding a little thing you mentioned in your last slide and something that I've mentioned in my last slide, and I wanted to know whether they contradict each other. In your last slide, I think you said something like, if the presence or absence of a classifier doesn't really make any change in meaning, then we have to look for pragmatic function. Mm-hmm. And is it more or less what you said?
Yeah, I said if the presence or absence is optional, then the question, then how can we find out why a speaker is using it or not using it?
Okay, so it's not okay. So I got it wrong because I understood if it doesn't make a change in meaning. So maybe I can ask it as a question now. My question was then whether you think that semantic functions and discourse functions are compatible or not. In my view, when the classifier is used has a discourse function, for example, of introducing a new participant, it can still have some semantic function of restricting the possible reference or giving more information on the size or the shape of the reference. Would you agree on that? Or for you, these two types of functions are not compatible? That's my question.
No, I think they are definitely compatible. And yeah, it's you would have both of those functions would be operating at the same time. That is, you have a form that has a certain meaning, and people are using it for a certain communicative purpose. Now, with reference to what you said before, I did say that speakers will sometimes describe presence or absence as synonymous. I didn't say that they always do that, but sometimes they do. They'll say, well, it doesn't matter whether you use this or not.
Okay.
If you use it, it means the same thing if you use it or if you don't use it. So that's what I meant by that.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Françoise. Now it's Spike's turn.
Hey, thank you. I really enjoyed this talk, and of course, I come from a perspective very similar to the one that you're coming from. I did want to just really say how much I appreciated the difference between the semantic function of referring rather than, say, denoting or meeting truth conditional values. That's just, I see it even in gender. I mean, you in some sense, you refer to a cat as either male or female in order to point to it. But I'm not sure that I would say that it's not automatic. It's so that people know which one you're talking about. And a similar thing with classifiers. My advisor, Doris Payne, had written about this in Yagua. I know that the same noun can refer to entities in different conditions. So the noun coffee, I think, is the classic example, right? You have beans, you have powder, and you have liquid. And you're going to have different classifier depending on what form it's in, but it's the same noun. And so I really like this idea of it's not about the denotation of the noun, it's about its function for referring. And so I just wanted a chance to say that out loud. Thank you. You brought it home with much more eloquence.
Well, this also speaks to the idea of, how do we understand the meanings of nouns? And so sometimes people will say that the classifier disambiguates, in other words, that the noun is in effect ambiguous, that the noun has several different meanings and the classifier is just picking one of those, which again goes back to the idea that the noun is determining the classifier. Whereas we can also think of the noun as not being specified for any of those things. And the classifier is actually adding something and saying, okay, here's how you should understand this coffee or, whatever, or banana plant or banana.
Roughly equivalent to adding another modifier of some kind, because it's not that the noun signifies, it's that it points to something and you're simply refining the pointer. Yeah.
Exactly.
So thank you.
Yeah, following up on this comment and question by Spike, I'm also thrilled about the idea of thinking about classifier as referring or participate in the act of referring prominently. And then my question is then, when we have concord, as you define, so we actually are talking about co-reference in some sense between independently referring expression potentially, which by the act of discourse, they co-refer. And well, that reminds me of this paper by Croft, which talks about anaphora, agreement as anaphora as agreement, and agreement as co-reference. So he switches the perspective of these markers as indexes with value, the same perspective as you're saying, that they refer, and they when they are in this kind of concord or agreement, we have co-reference. But my question is about the syntactic aspect of the things that we are dealing with. In Rosa's presentation, she had a question of whether there is embedding, integration within the same noun phrase or not. And that might be relevant to the question of agreement to the extent that we need to define some kind of syntactic domain where these classifier morphemes appear or not. So my question to you is, under this framework that you are presenting, should we separate the problems? Like we deal with reference in one kind of tier of organization of the sentence, and whether it's embedding or apposition or any kind of structure is independent from this perspective of reference?
Let me see if I understand. Well, it's still necessary if some kinds of lexical items are obligatorily specified for classification, let's say. So you still have to say that that's the case. I mean, that is, demonstratives must be marked for classification. I mean, so that's where the syntactic part of it would come in. That is, in some languages you have such marking, in other languages you don't have it. So you have to say, yes, that these, so the verb, subject of the verb has to be marked for, what kind of argument it is and so on. So that's something that, but then the question is the choice of what classifier goes there, or, what is the classifier contributing when you put one rather than another one there? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of question that that I'm asking. And so sometimes you don't have a choice. That is, in some languages, it's more grammaticalized than it is in other languages. And so, and also there, it matters how close to, if the noun is mentioned, how close to the noun we are. And so Carbit talks about the agreement hierarchy, for example, that the farther away from the noun you get, outside the noun phrase, for example, if you're talking about, using a verb, often you will find that there is less so-called syntactic agreement when you get farther away. But that too is functionally motivated. That is, if you are talking about modifiers of the noun, then it makes sense to not confuse the hearer by mentioning a noun that belongs to one category and then a modifier that belongs to another one. All right, are we still talking about the same, having to do with, well, I'm still identifying reference. Will it help me to identify the referent, or will it confuse me when I'm trying to identify the referent? So something that looks like syntax would be there. But I'm just arguing against this model of the controller and the target.
All right, thank you very much for your answer. Jorge, please.
Yes, I want to thank you first for a very thought-provoking talk. This was very enjoyable. I think you'll find an audience here that is fairly friendly towards your tenets of using non-elicited data and data that goes beyond the sentence. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about the role of interactional data. So I think we saw several presentations where classifiers were used as like anaphora or referential tracking devices in stretches of text that were primarily, I think, narrative texts. So I wonder if you had any insight about what we should expect if we were looking at a conversation, for example.
Well, and yes, and I guess that's because a lot of the texts or the papers that I used as the data sources, that was the kind of data that they had. Although there are some interactional ones, for example, the Miranya, one of the two speakers who are one's trying to help the other one figure out how to put together these shapes. So are you asking, would I expect a different kind of way of, probably Deixis would play a big role in the case of interactional data. That is because you share the here and now of the conversation. And so you know what's around here. And it's, I mean, that's the kind of thing, for example, you walk into a store and you say, I want 3 pointing to something, and then you use whatever classifier you have to use with the numeral. That is the kind of thing that you expect to find in interaction. And yeah, anaphora, I suppose that's something that you notice more in a narrative where you have some reference and then later on you have some further reference to the same thing.
Thank you. I think that maybe the example that you had from Tiago's own work about bring me the tubular, and he was referring to the gun, may fall into that realm, right? Like if you're sharing the here and now, maybe you can get away with doing
well, in that example, I don't know, maybe Tiago can help explain that. Does he usually take his gun when he goes out, the father?
Yeah. He could have used another classifier for like a blade kind of classifier, and the interlocutor would understand that it's the paddle, for instance. So there is some kind of conventionality of the classifier and the referent in the way that is highly accessible depending on the context.
Yeah, but maybe it's something that he regularly, every time he goes out, he takes such and such a thing. So he doesn't even have to mention the name of it at all, because the son knows what kinds of things his father wants him to go and get when he's getting ready to go out,
Yeah. All right. Are there any more questions?
Maybe just quickly to first thank you for accepting to be in our keynote. As Tiago mentioned in the introduction, your work, with a focus on the functions of classifiers, was very influential a couple of years ago when we met. And one of the questions that I have is how does diachrony plays a role in this, the explanation for the types of systems that we see out there in the world. One view of this, and you summarize this, the Colette's paper, Greenbald's paper, is that classifiers may evolve into more grammaticalized systems and maybe more like class nouns, African language types of systems. And the view that you describe now is still, I think, could go along with that other view, right? When you look at one thing is looking at the system at one point in time, but another when we see more in as they evolve over time. And in that sense, how much should we be paying attention to the variation that we see among speakers. Sometimes we tend to describe languages, particularly indigenous languages, as something more less dynamic than they are actually. And so how much should we be paying attention to variation among speakers?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that some of these systems will evolve into other kinds of systems and become, for example, more grammaticalized over time, although it's not inevitable that that always happens. So it's quite possible that some systems remain not very grammaticalized for a long period of time and don't, it's not that they must become more grammaticalized, but the grammaticalization itself is motivated. That is, if things become automatic, then that also makes it faster to process the thing. That is, you don't have to reflect, oh, let's see, why did the person use this form? But instead, I know that this form was chosen because it goes along with something else, and they're supposed to be understood as co-referential and so on. So grammaticalization is also a motivated process. Now, as far as understanding variation among speakers or speakers not being consistent with one another, that is a more difficult situation. That it's often, well, it depends really on what the variation is coming from. For example, is it a situation where the language is endangered and where younger speakers are using it differently from older speakers, for example? Or is it just speakers who are equally fluent, but they just use it differently? Could you clarify what sort of situation of variation between speakers you mean?
It was more about similar types of profiles of speaker with the same type of domain of the competence in the language, but more based on social considerations, more based on generational issues and things like that, which is variation it studies in other fields and subfields of linguistics, and how much they inform the evolution of the systems. More about that, how sensitive it's the grammar of classification to variation and to the dynamics of speakers being creative, using systems creatively, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that, yeah, social factors would definitely play a role. That is, if there are some speakers who are influential, whose way of speaking is seen as more valuable for whatever social reasons, it's possible that that their way of using the language would become more prevalent over time. And we've seen that with some types of variation, that that there's certain types of variation that prevail or become seen. Now, I'm not really talking about situations of standardization so much, but situations where speakers are signaling some type of social identity by speaking more like others, or avoiding speaking like others by signaling a different contrastive social identity. So that could happen. And I'm not that familiar with variation in use of classification markers to be able to say how that comes into it. So I think that would be a very interesting thing to investigate.
maybe very quick example of what I had in mind is that I was working with a group of teachers creating some written materials for the Sequoia children, and they were written down stories with tigers, with animals, all kinds of animals. And I remember the elder, I believe in the story, in the spoken version, used a female gender for this particular in the story. And then the teacher, one of them, changed it entirely to masculine forms. And then there was a discussion among them, but no, maybe you should back and switch it back to female markers. And he said, no, but tigers are strong, they are powerful, more or less like going with the associated notions that we have about tigers, right? Lions and such. And that was an interesting discussion from my perspective. Would be generational, would be, I don't know, but several issues that the conversations going on about how do we represent these animals in this specific written books for children. So that was more or less the spirit of my question.
Well, that's an interesting example, because I don't know if that's variation between, well, it could be, I guess it's variation in the sense that one speaker is thinking about a certain, associating gender with certain types of characteristics. Why was the older speaker using the masculine? Do you know?
The older speaker were using the most of the unknown gender, unspecified gender, let's say. Default would be the feminine. The default would be feminine, or like for small animals, right? When the gender is not relevant at all, default is the feminine. And so like by default in the story, this is just a generic tiger. But because of the way that the teachers were trying to portray this tiger in this small story, they were switching back to masculine. That was the context.
I see. So that sounds like actually a difference in the sort of the grammatical difference between them, in the sense that he is he's using the form that would be normally used for animals, whereas they are interpreting the gender as something about the characteristic of gendered people. And that's, yeah, it could be a generational thing. I mean, that certainly is happening now with things like gendered pronouns, you know, in various languages, that, you know, difference between older and younger speakers in understanding that. So yeah, thank you for the example.